Today will be the first time that we look at a quadratic equation where we cannot find a pair of numbers that multiplies to a times c that adds to b, which means it cannot be factored. So we're going to have to find another way to solve a quadratic equation. The next way that we're going to learn is called completing the square. So your objective is you're going to write, I will be able to factor perfect square trinomials and use completing the square to find the vertex. So here's what we're going to do. We need to find a new value of c that will make a perfect square trinomial, which means we have to come up with a perfect square number. The steps below, steps 1, 2, and 3, are going to explain how we find that perfect square number. Here's how it works. Whatever number b is, the number that's on the x, you're going to divide it by 2. You're going to cut it in half. After you have that number, you take that number and you square it. Once you have that number, you cut it in half, you squared it, now you will add it to the trinomial. Now we factor the perfect square trinomial, and it is always going to be half of what b was. Now these list of steps will make so much more sense in just a minute when we get to the first example. But please take a minute to write down all of those steps. All right, here's our first example. We have x squared plus 10x plus something. We're trying to figure out what perfect square number to put here. We're going to take the b number, which is our 10. We're going to take the 10. We're going to cut it in half. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We're going to take that answer and we're going to square it. 5 times 5 is 25. So in order to create a perfect square trinomial, which you'll see in just a minute, that means it is super easy to factor. We can use the 25. So let's go ahead and practice the next one. We take half of b, so -6, cut it in half, which is -3. We're going to square that, which means I have two -3's. -3 times -3 is a positive 9. So 9 is the number that we will add to both sides. Well, right now it's just to the 1, but in a minute when there's an equation, we'll add it to both sides. So here's how we do it. We're going to get an actual quadratic equation. The first thing you need to do is add or subtract the constant term to the other side. Instead of everything being on the left, we will want the constant to be on the right. So for example, we would want it to look like 2x squared plus 4x. We're going to have plus something because we're going to move that constant over to the other side by adding or subtracting. We want to create this blank space. Next, we will find the value that completes the square. That's what we just talked about. We take half of the b term, so half of that 4 would be 2. And then remember, we square that, which would be 4. So 4 would be the perfect square number that we would add. But we need to make sure we add it to both sides. So if I add a green 4 on the left, I must add a green 4 on the right. Once we have done that, now we factor the perfect square trinomial that we created. So the whole point of finding that magic 4 is so factoring can be done and it can be super easy. So now, once that is done, we will actually move the constant back over and we can get our vertex. We can actually steal it because it will be in vertex form. So let me show you an example what that looks like. So make sure you have all those steps down so you can refer back if you need to. Here's our first example. Right now it says y equals x squared plus 6x plus 4. The first thing I need you to know is we're going to take that y and we're going to change it to a 0. When it says y equals, this usually means we're ready to graph it. If it says 0 equals, that means we're actually going to solve it. So what we would like to do is change that to 0 because we are ready to solve it. Now, the first step said was that we need to create a blank space where the constant is. So I need to move that plus 4. So the opposite would be minus 4. So 0 minus 4 is -4 equals x squared plus 6x plus this empty space we just created by moving the 4. Now remember, we fill in that empty space by taking half of the b number, which would be 3, squaring that number, which would be 9. So 9 is the perfect square, the magic number, but make sure you add it to both sides. So now we have negative 4 plus 9 is 5, equals x squared plus 6x plus 9. Now if I go to factor that, if I want to find two numbers that multiply to 9, that add to 6, I'm going to go with 3 and 3. That means I have x plus 3 times x plus 3. I would like you to notice that because the x plus 3 is the exact same thing, that's the whole reason we did this, we created a perfect square trinomial, which means I can write the x plus 3 only one time, but say that it is squared, meaning I have two of them. And then if I subtract the 5 so that it's set back equal to 0 again, and then subtract the 5 to the other side, now I am in vertex form. 0 is equal to x plus 3 squared minus 5. And if you remember from Unit 10, we can steal the vertex from here. It is the opposite number of what's inside the parentheses. So the opposite of positive 3 is negative 3. But then the y value is exactly the way it is, negative 5. So the vertex of the parabola, if we were to graph it, would be negative 3, negative 5. So now take a moment, digest everything we just talked about. The first thing we did was set it equal to 0. Then we subtracted the 4 to create this blank space right here. And whatever you do to one side, you must do to the other. Then we found that magic number. We took half of b, which is 3, we squared it, which is 9. So we're adding 9 to both sides. Negative 4 plus 9 is 5. The whole reason we created this x squared plus 6x plus 9 is when we go to factor it, it creates the exact same binomial. It duplicates x plus 3 and x plus 3. So when that happens, we can just write the x plus 3 one time and just say that it is squared. We then simply subtracted the 5 back over, so now everything's on the same side and only 0 is on the left. Once we have that, we simply steal the vertex. Take a moment, see how that feels, but we will practice it again just to make sure we're good. So the first thing we're going to do is change the y to a 0 because we want to solve. We are not graphing right now. The next thing I need to do is to get my constant over to the other side. That leaves me with the equation negative 31 equals x squared minus 10x, plus something. I created space for that something. The way I find that something is I take my b value, my negative 10, I cut it in half, which is negative 5, and then I square that. Well, two negative 5s would be a positive 25. Now remember, if you add 25 to one side, this is the step that students will forget. Whatever you do to one side, you must do to the other. So if you add 25 here, make sure you add 25 here. Negative 31 plus 25 is negative 6. So now we have negative 6 equals x squared minus 10x plus 25. If we go to factor this, and we want to find two numbers that multiply to 25, that add to negative 10. Well, that's going to be the same number, negative 5 and negative 5. So that's x minus 5 and x minus 5. Because that duplicated, we're going to write it just one time and say that I have two of them, call it squared. And don't forget that negative 6 is still on the left side. Our last step is to add the 6 over so that it ends up on the other side. So now we have 0 equals x minus 5 squared plus 6. From here, we can now steal the vertex. The opposite of negative 5 is positive 5, and then the y stays the same, 6. The vertex is located at 5, 6. So how is that feeling? Are you feeling comfortable with those steps? If you are not, please take a moment and go back and look at the examples, re-watch it, maybe watch it without having to write, and see if it makes sense. If you feel you are ready and you can complete the square to create vertex form and steal the vertex coordinates from it, then you are done and you are ready to begin your assignment. If not, please identify what your questions are and please ask us in class.